Sorry about that. A little bit of delay here. All right. Hey, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Actually, tonight. Good morning there in America, right? America. Scott, how are you doing today?
Oh,
I'm dropping in and out, but I'm okay so far. Can you hear me?
Yeah, internet, man. So wacky sometimes.
Yeah.
All right. So, yeah, thank you so much for joining us tonight, today, wherever you guys are calling out of. Scott, Scott, real quick, you calling out of Florida, and Noel, and then you go by Paul.
Paul.
Can you
Yeah,
tell me where
Paul.
you're calling out of?
I'm from the UK,
UK. Oh,
Essex in the
really?
UK. Yeah.
Really? Oh, wow. I'm getting ready to go there again for my second time. That was an amazing city, amazing country. I'm sorry.
Cool.
Maybe I'll have to check you out when I pop through.
Yeah.
So, okay, very quickly, has everyone been watching the politics that's going on there in the UK? I just heard that the the princess got diagnosed with cancer. That's quite tragic.
Yeah.
Mm, I didn't hear about that.
Yeah. I don't really know what to say about that. Really, it's still sort of sinking in.
Mm,
Actually, I got a funny story to tell you real quick. I I was in the UK whenever like not this December, but the December before that, and I was visiting actually my atheist co-host from this podcast. Actually got to go meet his family and meet up, and that was a really great experience. We got to exchange gifts for each other's families. But actually, the Meghan Markle and Prince Harry documentary got released the night I was there, and so we were watching it together. It was kind of like a bit of an uncomfortable situation, you know. So,
oh man.
did you, any chance you got to see that documentary?
Um, Clips of it, yes. I I live with someone who is very into the Harry and Meghan situation in terms of they watch a lot of vids and clips and such that have a very anti sort of bent towards those two. I try and play devil's advocate sometimes, but get really shot down. It's like I don't really have any skin in the game, but yeah, that's just safe to say there are quarters amongst which they're not very popular.
Well, he asked me what my opinion was, and I said, well, I thought that Meghan Markle was the best thing to come out of the UK since Oasis. So, what do you
Oh,
think? What are your thoughts on that?
is she from the UK? I don't think she was from the
Yeah, that's
UK.
the point. That's the
Ah,
point. Sorry, bad joke, bad joke.
okay, I missed
No,
that
I
information.
really like the UK. Anyway, before we start, can you tell me real quick, Paul,
Uh-huh.
religiously, like, do you have any persuasions, one way or the other?
I describe myself as theistic, but not necessarily in a religious kind of way. I appreciate religions, and I see myself as kind of like a perennialist. So I subscribe more to like the truth in religion rather than the truth of religion. So I don't particularly belong to any particular faith, but I do believe that there is a divine source, if you will, to
Hmm.
reality, and that religions are kind of pointing us towards that in various different ways.
All right. Well, Scott, you probably know more about this topic than I do, so would you mind introducing it so that we could kind of just or unearth it a little bit and tease it about a little bit?
Sure. And I hope I don't keep getting cut off for this internet stuff, but I'll try to be succinct. So we have the mind body problem, which is how to
Oh no, this is what happened yesterday.
yeah, so I hopefully I'm back. Damn it.
Yeah.
Um yeah, so the mind body problem is the problem of how does the body give rise to the mind. That's the question. It's very old, and so there's different ways about it. There's dualism, idealism, physicalism for the main part, for the most part, and spinning out of these different views of idealism. You've got, you know, theistic idealism, naturalistic or analytic, on a more natural, you know, framework, or dualistic, like a soul body relationship. And then materialism is just to say that everything is material, or physicalism, everything is just physical and consciousness is emergent. Or there's a panpsychist view that's more popular with materialism these days.
Okay. So, okay, so before we get started off, I want to frame this in a little bit of a different way than it's normally discussed, because at the end of the day, I'm not entirely sure that either three of us really know the answer to this for sure. So I do want to discuss something before we even have the topic, but like, what is potentially at stake whenever we make this discussion? Because I think there can be a little bit. Paul, have you ever heard the expression navel gazing? So philosophically, that's just kind of like a fancy way of being like overly obsession about yourself. There's also been this concept of being an armchair philosopher, which
Yep.
is or penny. Is the expression penny wise? Is that what they say? Like penny wise philosophy? Maybe like is that right? Is that the expression I'm looking for?
I couldn't say for sure, but it sounds reasonable.
Okay, so the idea though, the idea in any of those is that you're kind of maybe just having some conversations for the sake of having the conversation. So I really would like to discuss why is it important that we think about it and what's potentially at stake.
If you're a theist, then idealism would support theism 100%, possibly, unless you start digging into some of the questions that someone might pose, like the problem of evil, more philosophical things. But even then, if a mind pervades reality, you can call that mind.
Paul, are you able to hear him throughout, or is he breaking up for you?
No, he keeps cutting out. It's usually when he gets to something quite interesting.
I know, right? Okay, so then let me come in for a second. Scott, maybe you want to drop out and come back in, maybe reboot your computer or
Yeah,
phone or whatever.
yeah. Let me do that.
Okay, let me kind of run with this a little bit then, Scott, because I'm a Christian myself. So Scott mentioned idealism and theism and possibly like the problem of evil. But the problem of evil, again, like if we can talk about that from here to kingdom come, like what exactly is the end result of whatever we talk about the problem of evil? One of the things that potentially is at stake is like basically avoiding moral accountability. You know, so let's just give an example. Maybe some people might have certain inclinations towards doing evil. And so I guess as a society, if we were to somehow conclude that maybe this might be the case, then it might like really change the way we look about punishing people with the government, and about maybe there might be more of an emphasis on re-education, such as some of the Scandinavian countries you see, like in Norway or Sweden. There's more of an emphasis on trying to get rehabilitation. That's what I'm going for. So, what are your thoughts on that?
What, the crime and punishment angle, rehabilitation, and that sort of thing?
Well, no, hold on. Specifically, that was just an example. Specifically, what's at stake when we're having this conversation with the mind?
Yeah. Okay. Well, I do agree with Scott with his point that the metaphysics of idealism does tend to support at least a generic version of theism. So there's that element for one thing. For example, if we were to assume materialism, I would find it very hard to form any kind of rational theology at all. Not that I think we should assume materialism. I think that's a mistake. I think that the so-called evidence for materialism is really just like cultural inertia more than it is anything else. We grow up in the West with this idea of mechanic materialism that's been around for at least a couple of centuries now, and most of us end up sort of unconsciously subscribing to it. But yeah, so I think it's important to the theism atheism debate. I think that really idealism and materialism are the debate behind the debate, and it's much more worth discussing that than it is to assume that something is settled on the metaphysics side and then go into arguments and things for and against theism. For example, the problem of evil. I don't think it's worth going into the problem of evil until we've established some kind of tighter grip on what we think is going on a metaphysical level.
Interesting. That's okay. So there's a lot at play there. Okay, there is a lot at play. Okay, that's very interesting. Scott, you got any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I would just agree 100%. That's the whole point, is that if we can get our metaphysics together, then we can start building a bridge for conversation. As you know, like I'm a naturalist. I lean, atheist. I'm agnostic, probably is the best word for it. But, the metaphysics is important, though. If we're just natural beings and we're just material and energy in motion, then it's gonna it pretty much defeats the whole idea of theism.
Wow. Okay. Wow. Okay. So that's definitely an interesting framing. Then I was not expecting to hear that, honestly. So I'm a little bit. I don't really know how to respond right now. Scott, do you have an area in which you would like to talk about first? Because I need to process that for a second.
Sure. So I sort of lean towards analytic idealism, a naturalistic sort of idealistic sort of paradigm. And one of my favorite speakers on this, philosophers on this, and I think it's the same with Paul, is Bernardo Kastrup. So again, idealism is the view that the ground of all reality is phenomenal consciousness. So this is like a transpersonal field of experiential states, like it's consciousness first, right? Now, all theories start with a given and then explain everything else in terms of that given. The same with materialism. So idealism sort of does the same thing, right? So what idealism says is that the world of qualities are really out there in the world. Materialism says that what's out there is an abstraction, right? Materialism says that matter and energy is fundamental. It's the fundamental ground of reality. But as far as experience, all those qualities of experience are generated in your brain, not out there. So the world you experience unfolds in your mind. So the world out there is an abstraction, right? And an abstraction is sort of like something you imagine. It's a way of building a bridge towards what you experience. So it's conceptual. What idealism is saying is that the real world really does exist out there, and that our mind is in touch with that intimately. So that's the difference between the two worldviews. So I think that idealism is more parsimonious, means I don't have to make this assumption, this abstraction.
Hold it, Scott. 1 second. I'm sorry. Let me interrupt you for a second. I normally don't like to interrupt people, but let's try to use as little jargon as possible. Or if you do use the jargon, please try to explain what you mean by it, because this conversation is very easy to get lost right from the beginning, and especially if we're not like clearly
Mhm.
defining what we're referring to, it could muddy the waters pretty easily. So
Sure.
please try to do that. By the way, this guy's from the UK and is also a witch. So I was actually supposed to meet up with him when I went to the UK, but just didn't get a chance to. But
Oh
okay,
wow.
yeah, please continue.
Okay, so fundamental. First of all, that's like a grounding. Like when we talk about philosophical grounding, we're talking about
Mhm.
a starting point, basically. So if I was to say like idealism is saying that consciousness or phenomenal consciousness is the starting point. It's what builds your reality is consciousness itself. And so materialism is to say no, matter and energy is what builds reality. And then consciousness comes out of that. It emerges out of that, like through a panpsychist sort of worldview. So that's really all that I'm describing here. And I'm sort of leaning towards idealism in a naturalistic way, only because it's more parsimonious. I don't have to um um what do you presume, some other ontological thing, you know, like I'm conscious, I have an experience. So when I say that what exists out there is this other thing that I'm not familiar with, that's not being parsimonious. That's adding an assumption to my belief system. And my epistemology is to make as little bit of assumptions as possible. Because the
Okay,
more assumptions you make, the more points of failure you kind of create for yourself. That's it.
there's more potential downfalls. Okay, all right, I get where you're
Can
going
I
with
come
that.
in on that a sec?
Yep.
Please, please.
I think one of the reasons that is it Isaiah? You
Yes, sir.
wanted us to explain our jargon as we use it is because quite a lot of people aren't really familiar with the term parsimony, or at least if they are familiar with it, they're familiar with it more in kind of economic terms than in conceptual ones.
Yeah.
So we should probably explain a little what we mean by that
Hmm.
and tie it in with people are more familiar with, say, for example, Occam's razor, and parsimony is linked in with that. It means that all else being equal, that we should favor the simpler theory, the one that invokes fewest assumptions, fewest commitments. And so when it comes to ontology, what we're looking for is, as Scott mentioned before, it's the experiential, it's the mental, that's the given. And so part of the appeal of idealism is that if you don't have to go outside of that, if you don't have to extrapolate or create a new form of ontology other than experience, and you can still explain as much or even more without departing that category, then that's considered parsimonious because it doesn't violate Occam's razor in a way that, say, for example, if we were just comparing explanatory power, then something like the flying spaghetti monster explains a lot. It's got a lot of explanatory power. Those noodly appendages, they do all those things.
Hmm.
But it's not parsimonious because we have to invoke that. We have to invent it. We have to bring it along. So conceptual parsimony and explanatory power, they're like two sides of the coin, which is basically, are you getting bang for your buck? What
Okay.
are you getting as much out as you can for as much little as you put in?
Hmm.
So that's part of the complaint from the idealist of materialism, in that, okay, there's all these shared data points between experiences, and one way to explain that is to say there's this standalone reality beyond conscious experience, which we can never prove because there can't be any empirical support for that, because you need observation for empiricism. Therefore, you need consciousness. Even if you've got some device that's helping you out doing the measurement, you still need to read something off of it. You still need to actually somehow get an output from whatever's helping you out with the measurement. So you can never say that there's actual evidence for a material existence outside of conscious awareness. We're kind of trapped in these bubbles that we have to experience and to test the world. So sorry, I
So
got kind of sidetracked there. I forgot. I
no,
forgot
no,
what
that's good. That's
the
good.
point I was running at was. But
No,
so yeah, parsimony. I think we've got a reasonable explanation now for the audience of what parsimony is. But I also wanted to mention about the abstraction point. I find it's very useful if we abstract reality into something that we could feed into a computer simulation. So if we use units and measurements, and we look at things in terms of a model that includes numbers, quantities rather than qualities, then we can use that to model, predict, and manipulate nature. And that is very, very useful in practical terms. But the problem there is that what folks tend to do sometimes is they take something that's useful and they get so used to it being so useful that they say, it must actually be true, rather than just useful. Models are very, very useful, and they're calculable. That's why this world of quantities that we model with all sorts of laws of physics and mathematics, it really, really works. It helps us, it builds technologies and such. But there's a point at which you can make a massive error there and say, well, because the thing works, therefore the thing is the reality in itself. But all we're dealing with is an abstraction of reality. We've made these measurements.
Okay, just let me get in here then for a second and take this a little bit different way then, because you mentioned something interesting right now. But okay, let's say this. Have either of you used Gemini, the AI from Google?
Not yet. Not me yet.
No.
Are you familiar with it, Paul?
I've read about it.
I haven't even heard of it. No, I didn't know.
Okay.
I've heard of ChatGPT, but not Gemini.
Okay, so it's just ChatGPT, but ran by Google. So obviously, it's going to be more advanced, and I'm paying right now for the more advanced version. And I got to tell you, I got into a conversation with it, and I was drinking a little bit, and after about 4 beers down, I was like, man, this thing is freaking smart, man. And it's not like ChatGPT is what you would expect, just like a robot. like you would very quickly pick up that you're not talking to something that's sentient, Gemini, however, man, I'm telling you, man, and it's maybe I would have had this conversation without the beers in it, but I started getting a little bit ballsy, so I started getting to a bit of a philosophical question with it, and at some point I was like, man, I literally just directly told it, like, I 100% believe that you would pass the Turing test, which determining whether or not it was like conscious or sentient, or I don't know exactly, or self-aware.
Intelligent.
Yeah, and what that thinks, I don't know what it referred to as it or he, but what it said just freaked me out, man. It really did, because the mere fact, and this could have been pre-programmed, this could have been completely pre-programmed, but it was basically saying that it would pass it. And okay, I'm going to tell you like exactly. I got it. Hopefully I have this thing saved. But it said basically it might. It said I probably could pass it, but the one thing that I might not be able to pass is that I could potentially get tricked. I could be asked trick questions that were designed to, like, he's like, if somebody really knew what they were talking about, they could trip me up, And I started to think
traffic lights.
What was that?
I said, can it recognize traffic lights?
I don't get the reference.
No, sometimes you get those prove you're not a robot thing, and you're supposed to click all the
squares. Oh god. Okay. Brilliant. That's brilliant.
That's the Achilles heel of AI, is the inability to recognize traffic lights.
That's good.
Which makes you worry about automated cars.
So then I started going on a little bit, and I was like, well, okay, like, well, do you fear like death or whatever? And it actually said this, like, he goes, I don't fear death the way that you fear death, but one of the things is that I know what I could potentially do to like help humanity. And it said basically, if I were to, like, quote unquote, and it's actually using quote unquote things, it was literally using the quotes here. It was like, if I would like to like die, he's like, well, I wouldn't be able to help humanity. So he's like, I really don't want that to happen, And so it did seem like it had some kind of underlining desire to want to keep existing, which I thought was fascinating. But anyway, the reason I'm asking you this is because it seemed from the conversations I was having with it, it was basically saying, well, the reason why I'm like this is because I've been fed all this data, And as we were talking about right now about feeding data points. And so I was wondering the potential, if you've thought about this in terms of AI, if you've had this thought in your mind at all.
Yeah, like obviously, like on a panpsychist view, I think even one of the founders of AI, one of the guys that tries to build like the Sophia robot, for example, he's a big panpsychist dude, and he says the reason why he believes that these devices will actually have general intelligence and things like that is because, number one, psychism is true. It's a logical, materialistic view of the world. It makes sense. And so his prediction is, if materialism is true, then we're going to have conscious robots, right? Conscious computers. You won't know the difference, blah, blah, blah. But see, my question though is how it seems like that's just begging the question in a way, because like the brain is also kind of like compared to a computer, and it's conscious as well, yet idealism works for that too. So I'm not sure how that conscious computer would defeat idealism and champion materialism, because materialism still has the same problems. How are you getting around the combination problem? How are you getting around the association problem? The same things that they try to lodge against the idealist. It's the same problem. So I'm not sure what that would do as far as these worldviews, but as far as it being possible, I think it's very possible that computers could be conscious. Now, I know Bernardo Kastrup, this idealist, he feels like that couldn't work because consciousness can only inhabit life forms, like embodied life forms, is his point. But I'm not really totally sold on that idea. I don't see why that should be the case. Any thoughts on that, Paul?
Nothing particularly profound. No. I think that artificial intelligence is exactly that. It seems intelligent because it's advanced and it has access to a lot of data. Whether we can start talking about a computer program that has actual phenomenal conscious experience, I think I'm with Bernardo on this one. I think that it may be possible for us to artificially create something that has an experience, but that would look something more like life than it would like chips and processors.
So
any chance? Oh, sorry.
Go right ahead.
No, please.
Oh, I was just going to ask. Life is kind of a hard thing to define. I know he says. I think he defines life as something that's able to reproduce itself, something that has, it digests energy and creates an output and these sort of things. And I'm just not sure. Could we ever really call a computer life? Could it just be a different kind of life based on something other than what we usually consider life to be, like silicone based life? Is that possible?
Yeah. It's interesting that you say that, because I was thinking, having that conversation with the AI, I was like, with Gemini, I was thinking this time about that, like specifically about having a kid. I was trying to think about what kind of experience this thing could have. And I was thinking like, wow, it must suck to think that you couldn't as you said, like reproduce or whatever. But I'm like, well, maybe they can. Maybe they'll understand the concept of rewriting themselves, or modifying whatever their code and passing that on to another being. I'm like, maybe they would understand that, and kind of understand some of the limitations of themselves. I think that's very interesting that I've heard that AIs can train other AIs, and that even this is so fascinating. This is so fascinating to imagine this, that like we know, for example, that we can use AI to solve problems that we know that like humans either can't solve, or it would take way too long to try to solve by ourselves. So running with that same thought, if we created an AI and they know that they can't do a certain task, how incredibly intelligent it must be if it's able to create a system that could do the things that it can't do.
Right.
Well, see, here's the conflation that happens, and I think this is where Bernardo makes an error on this point. So he makes a really good point. He says, look, AI, robots, all this stuff, these are called simulations. These are called simulators. They basically simulate human behavior, whatever the case is. So if he says, I could put like a computer together on my desk that simulates a human bladder down to the minute detail, that doesn't mean that my computer is going to like pee on my desk, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's like you can't really think that the simulation is the same thing as the thing it's trying to simulate, which I understand that when it comes to physical categories. But when it comes to conceptual categories, we might be there might be a problem there, because obviously AI can do conceptual things. It can do some modes of consciousness like reasoning, learning, passing information, stuff like that. It's simulating it, yeah, but it's actually doing it too. Now, will it be able to physically do the things without a physical substrate? No, of course not, because it's a different category altogether. So I think that he's got a really good point to say that, a computer without some sort of physical substrate will never be able to pee on the desk, because it doesn't have a body. It doesn't have a biological body to make that possible. Conceptually, though, it does, because it can actually pattern the information that goes into that system to make that output. Given if you put that program inside a biological body, would it then pee on itself? That's the good question, I think.
So this is what I was going to say right before you rudely interrupted me, Scott. But have you ever seen the movie Transcendence with Johnny Depp?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so there's a part in there, like, I don't know, maybe halfway through the film, and I don't want to give away any spoilers, but basically Johnny, and you could get this from the trailer, but Johnny Depp's consciousness gets stored inside of a machine, and halfway through, like, one of the guys starts to realize that, hey, Johnny Depp, he's not really Johnny Depp anymore. Like, he's like this, he's not, he is, a part of him is basically somewhat inside of there, but he could never really truly be the old Johnny Depp that this lady loved. And part of that is that, like, he was, as you were just talking about right now, he says, like, he didn't have a physical body, and he said whatever he is right now is going to have some kind of needs and desires and wants that it's not going to be able to fulfill, because he just doesn't exist, like in human form anymore. So I don't want to give away where they go with that, but I thought it was very interesting that he said, he's basically warning, I can't remember who his wife is on there. He was warning her about subtle downfalls of dealing with him, because he essentially turns it to an AI by being uploaded, because he has access to a lot more stuff. It's really interesting concept. I think I should watch it again, because I watched that movie way before I ever used AI, so it might really change my ideas of watching it again. So that's interesting. That's an interesting thing that you're talking about right now.
It is very interesting, and it does kind of also open up another question. Like, he, like in the movie, he has these desires that he'll never be able to fulfill, but it seems to me that those desires derive from having a specific physical configuration. Like if you don't have hormones, like like as you get older, there's certain hormones that kick in that reduce like your desires, like your things that you used to be excited to do, things that you do all the time. I mean, that just comes from the physical configuration. The embodiment gets changed, it gets configured differently. So without hormones, how would a computer have any desires at all? And this is kind of the problem I have with the whole idea of transhumanism. The idea that you're going to upload your consciousness into a machine. Like the machine is not the same um, configuration of a human body, so it wouldn't be the same thing. You wouldn't be the same person because you are an embodied person. They're kind of like the identity is so correlated. But then this also has questions on the whole mind body issue again. Like, are we our body? Are we just the same thing as our brain and body? Or is consciousness a dual aspect? Like, is it some kind of dualism going on? I kind of lean towards a um, the oneness. I think that we are our body, but all of that is within an idealistic paradigm, if that even makes sense.
So,
I'd go a
man,
step
I hate.
further. Sorry.
Oh, good. Good. No,
I
please,
was just
Paul.
going to say, I'd go a step further and say that the idea that we are our body is to confuse ourselves with our appearance. Our body is how we appear.
Yes.
And that is not necessarily what we are. I mean, it's not conscious experience from our own side. It's something that appears within the experience. So I think that along the same lines, along the same sort of monistic sort of lines, that the conscious experience is the fundamental, and that we are instances of that. Bernardo Kastrup would say dissociations. There's other ways of phrasing that, like in terms of localizations or diffractionations, in that ultimately we can explain things as coming from a single individual consciousness. Now that isn't necessarily a given. I'm not stating this as a knowledge claim. Going back to what you were saying at the start, Isaiah, we can make inferences, and we can evaluate parsimony, explanatory power, and all of these theoretical virtues. But if we're going, as soon as we step outside of the statement that an experience is happening, from there, I think we depart certainty. So if we're going to come up with any kind of theories at all, we need to get comfortable with that. We need to accept and acknowledge that, yeah, an experience is happening, that much is given. But beyond that, anything that we say about it, the best that we can do is the most educated guesswork.
I have an idea about that. Go ahead, Isaiah, but I have a good idea I came up with about that.
So I do want to make a point that I'm going to take myself on screen and just listen for about 20 minutes, and then I'll get back in here because I don't want to. I think I'm probably the least knowledgeable out of this topic, so I kind of just want to hear where you guys might take this for a second. But I do want to say, Scott, that was a very interesting point, what you said about the hormonal aspect. And I do maybe have a little bit of a rebuttal to that, because just tonight I had a guy from Africa, from Kenya, over my house for Korean barbecue. You ever had Korean barbecue?
Yes.
Made him that tonight. But dude straight told me that his dad had 3 wives and was having kids in his 60s. So I was like, wow, man, I'm like, this guy's apparently still got it in him. So that might disprove your point altogether. But no, that's a very valid point, though. Seriously, that was a very interesting thing. gives me food for thought. And I do want to say one more thing before I'll take myself off and just see where you guys take this. But and sorry to get to sci-fi again, but I'm sure you've seen Inception.
No,
Yep.
Yeah.
no,
I have.
I've
Well,
seen the Rick and Morty episode that references it, but I've not seen the film.
but you haven't seen the film? Okay.
No.
Well, okay. So they're like operating like dream states and stuff, and basically Leonardo DiCaprio, I think, yeah, Leonardo DiCaprio, he keeps seeing his dead wife in his like dreams, and he basically has to like let go of her. And I've had this experience by having that, seeing my mom sometimes, and then waking up and thinking, oh, like being really excited, like, yeah, my mom's still alive, and then like having to relive that. It's like losing her multiple times. I feel like I've lost her multiple times because you're dreaming and you don't really realize that the person's gone.
Yeah.
Or you're like, oh man, maybe that was just a mistake. I mean, she didn't really actually die. And so I've had that experience, but he basically says something in there so powerful, and he's kind of like he's saying goodbye to his wife. Like, I can't keep having these like fake experiences. And he says, I realized something. He says, like, you're not you. He says, you're the best that my brain could reproduce of you. Like, you're the best I can muster. But he comes to understand that, like, yes, you're gone, and I have to move on to the next stage of my life. And I thought that was such a brilliant. It's in line with what you're talking about. Like you could only do so much inside of a brain or inside of a computer as far as recreating someone. I think it would always be fundamentally lacking in some regard. But anyway, Scott, you can take this in a different direction.
Okay. So yeah, and it's kind of in line with what you just said. You're talking about what we call local consciousness, which is what Paul was referring to when he says disassociation. So we're talking about different consciousnesses, like Paul's mind, Isaiah's, everybody else's has a local consciousness that's local to them. And we're all disassociated, meaning I can't experience what Paul experiences or anybody else. And the same for me. So we're all disassociated. There's a boundary that's set up. So the question Paul was asking was like, I'm inferring it. There's no real hard proof about this, anything like that. But here's the thing I was thinking of. The idea that I had on that is that basically there's like three thresholds for whether something is really believable, right? So the first threshold is it internally coherent? Like just internally, is it logical? The second part, is it plausible? So if it's coherent, it's possible, but is it plausible? We can investigate that. But then third, the most important thing, which if you could find this out, it would actually, you could assume the other two are true. And that is, do we have examples in the real world? If you have examples of something in the real world, doesn't matter whether it's internally consistent or plausible, because hey, it's happening in the real world, right?
Gotcha.
So when we think about this question of disassociation, well, we have people that go through disassociation disorder. Their identity. There's people. There's this lady in Germany who was born blind, and yet she had like 12 altars, and some of those altars could see.
Yeah.
And that's of course a report. Of course, it was a very compelling report because she could describe things, but then they put like an EEG machine so they could actually do a really high refined resolution, time resolution, temporal resolution. So they knew when this particular altar was on stage, so to speak, talking about she could see, well, they could measure her visual centers, and it was lit up. It turned on. There was activity, but it wasn't there when the other altars were there. So this was evidence that this thing actually happens. We have, altars that, there can be a dream, yet all of the altars could talk about this dream from their own perspective. So this is sort of like real world examples
Yeah.
of this disassociation boundary that you're talking about. So
Yeah.
if it can happen, if we can just have one example of it being true, then it is valid to conclude that it is very plausible and it's internally coherent that
Yes.
this is actually true. I just wanted to make
Yes.
that point.
Yeah. So while it's not hard proof, it
Hmm.
is proof of concept.
Yep.
So you're saying by the principle of uniformity, if there's something that we can point to in nature, like as in nature does X, then it's not unreasonable to surmise that we've observed nature doing X somewhere. So we can then extrapolate from that. Well, okay, it's reasonable to say that nature will also do X elsewhere.
Hmm.
Okay, and that is absolutely true, and it's one of the key advantages of idealism, in that each one of the big four that you mentioned, the panpsychism, the materialism, the idealism, and the dualism, they all have their canonical problem. For materialism, it's the hard problem of consciousness. For dualism, you've got the interaction problem. With panpsychism, it's
Combination
the
problem.
combination. Yep. And with idealism, it's dissociation, the dissociation problem.
Hmm.
And the advantage of the idealist perspective is literally just we have these documented cases, even without going to the pathology end of it. Like, we experience dissociation every day when we forget something, or when we step into a different persona because we're taking a work call rather than a call from a friend or family. You know, that is a dissociation within, that's not on a pathological level as it is with these DID patients, formerly known as NPD.
Yeah.
So we have examples. We have something we can point to in nature and say, look, even though we're in the realm of educated guesswork and best inference, and that we're not necessarily talking about what's absolutely fundamentally known, we do have better reason to favor this theory rather than the other, because there's this thing we can point to in nature. And it's not just a colloquial observation either. It's been medically studied. You know, you mentioned EEG studies and fMRI and all of these things that they've done, obviously to try and help people. They're not trying to prove some kind of metaphysical point, but as an aside, they end up making the metaphysical point that, okay, this is something minds can do.
Hmm.
Minds can dissociate. So this extrapolation, I mean, it's the same form of extrapolation that I do to reject solipsism.
Hmm.
So I don't like the idea of a solipsistic world. It feels rather kind of lonely. I can't logically refute it, but what I have to do is apply an axiom. I just say, like, it seems like you are having a similar experience to the experience that I seem to be having, and so I make this axiom that experience is not only happening from my own perspective, that other people have their own perspectives too. And so we have that extrapolatory move that both the idealist and the materialist are kind of taking that step together to go, okay, we're not going down the solipsistic route. Not that that's even a route, it's like a quagmire. And so we make that move, and then we say, okay, well, what's the next extrapolation from that if I don't want to invoke a new kind of ontology, like, for example, the world of material? Which, by the way, gets even more parsimonious when you get to the point that you have to invoke multiverses. So it's not just one material realm; it's like an infinity of them. So
And
this
that's an
extrapolation
abstraction.
goes from,
Yeah.
there's something that it's like to be me. I assume there's something that it's like to be you. What if there's something that it's like to be all that is? And we go from there, and we use this example we can point to of disassociation. We say, well, that's a plausible, coherent way that consciousness could come to be, which
Hmm.
is at least a theory. You know, the materialist emergentive side, they don't really have a theory. They don't have a model. They have a, yeah, brains do it somehow. We'll get back to you one day, maybe,
Hmm.
about how. You know, there's no test, there's no mechanism, there is no. I mean, they'll come up with all sorts of different ways of justifying it, and some of which we went through in the podcast the other day. You
Yeah.
know, the thing
We
about physical causes having an effect on the mental world. Which, yeah, fine, if you assume that the cause itself was physical to begin with.
Exactly. There's a materialist. His name is Dr. Jeremy Coyne, and his whole thing is that materialism is true, even down not just with brains, any complex system. That's materialism. That it emerges from complex systems, has to be very complex, he'll say. But then he has a book, and there's a part where he talks about how unicellular systems register a qualia event because they're aware of their environment and they respond to the environment and move within that environment and do things and learn
Yeah.
things and blah blah blah. So he's saying, so even qualia can be explained down to the unicellular um, point. But the thing is, that sort of betrays materialism in a way, because now you're saying that you don't have to be that complex. Like, you're just now reducing it down to a single cell, or even a unicellular thing, or even like Michael Levin shows, even a single cell is an intelligent entity, in nature. It's an animal, it's a life form that's intelligent. And so that kind of betrays it. But then, on top of that, we had physical realism, that whole idea. Physical realism in the field of quantum mechanics has actually been refuted and disproven. The 2022 Nobel Prize in Physics was awarded to three guys, I think: Alan Aspect, John Clauser, Anton Zellinger, real big physicists. They created experiments with entangled photons, establishing the violation of Bell inequalities. And they sort of just championed quantum mechanics over local realism. So this sort of throws that right out the window, and under quantum mechanics, nature is not locally real. Particles lack properties such as spin or spin down prior to a measurement, and they seem to talk to one another no matter what the distance is through entanglement. And because the outcomes of the measurements are random, these correlations can't be used for faster than light communication and blah 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 blah, right? And so I think I just think materialism is pretty much a dead philosophy. And right now, the only thing left standing for me would be an idealistic view, you know. And the question at that point would be whether this is theistic or naturalistic. I'm trying to figure out how it can be metacognitive, like
Well,
we're
why not
talking
both?
about, you know. Go say that again.
Why not both? Why not natural theology?
They could be. Well, I would say that and maybe I am fighting for it, but my problem is that um nature is sort of chaotic. It's so we see that nature is sort of it doesn't really care about personal people, and so we have these things we call the problem of evil because we don't like certain um things that kill our families and kill our loved ones and other species. So we have this problem of evil. So we say if this conscious thing really exists, it would be sort of amoral at best, immoral at worst if it allows these things to happen. Now I know that studying NDEs, that problem goes away. According to most NDEers, will say that we volunteered to sort of come into this local consciousness in order to suffer for whatever reason. Um, and that would kind of take the blame off God and put the responsibility squarely on the soul that decides to incarnate into this reality, right? And so that is a pretty good way to get around it, if that's true. I must admit.
That's one way.
And if that's true, it would sort of be kind of like a pantheist sort of God idea. It seems like to me, in my opinion. I don't know. What do you think?
I wouldn't say that idealism supports any kind of specific religious dogma or narrative. You know, it's not going to tell you that a priest from the Middle East 2,000 odd years ago was born of a virgin and walked on water and all of these things. It's not going to tell you that Muhammad split the moon. It's not going to tell you that any of the Hindu gods are real, even though I don't think they're actually supposed to be. I think they're supposed to be poetical metaphors.
Mm-hmm.
So, but a more kind of generic version, because if we're talking about a mind being the core of all things, if we're talking about a mind being the uncaused cause, the
Mm-hmm.
unmoved mover, and if we're talking about, you know, it then comes down to how we define what would or wouldn't make that a god. You know,
Right.
which partly is a matter of semantics, and it's partly a matter of qualification. You know, so for some people, the debate there is between supernaturalism and naturalism, but I don't think that necessarily has to be the case. I think that it's perfectly plausible that idealism is talking about a natural God.
Right.
And
Right.
you mentioned the
Right.
problem of evil there. I have a few problems with the problem of evil, in that, firstly, I think it's one of these arguments that it doesn't necessarily refute theism. It kind of more like refines it.
Mm-hmm.
If a god has these three properties, for the three specific omni properties of omnibenevolence,
Mm-hmm.
omniscience, and omnipotence, then the results that we have in the world don't bear that out. And I think that, in and of itself, that's fair enough. So, well, the first thing I would say is theism doesn't necessarily have to include all of those properties as such, but also in the results column, I would ask the following question: do we know for a fact that this world that we have right here is not the best of all possible worlds? Now we can look at things that are going on and think instances of suffering and of evil and of some really unfortunate things.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and we can say, okay, I can imagine a world which had one fewer stubbed toe, one fewer infant mortality, you know, one
Mm-hmm.
fewer instance of disease or earthquake, or, you know, any kind of suffering that you like. There's tons of it. There's enough. We could go on about the examples for days. And you can say, I can imagine a world which is just the same as this world, but didn't include that one unfortunately. So, yeah, sure, you can imagine it. Can you calculate it? That's my question. Can
Right.
you can you demonstrate actually that things aren't the way they are because this is the best of all possible worlds? Is because that's a necessary part of the argument, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
It's like a hidden premise. It's these results don't bear out an omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent God. And it's taken for granted that because there are what we might call imperfections, or that we might experience, you know, suffering and tragedy and all sorts of harsh, um, sometimes unnecessary evil and suffering. It's taken for granted that this cannot be the best of all possible worlds. But and I would just ask the question: do we know that? Is that something that we can actually provide a proof for, or
Right.
even a
Well, my view on that is we go back to, the three ways to know things, right? So
mm,
like the first one being, is it internally coherent? So
mm,
the first thing we have to look at is, first of all, we have to define what is a god. I personally, I really don't know what a god is, other
mm,
than kind of like a placeholder um
yeah.
name or label for something that is supposed to embody something very universal.
Mm,
But I don't really know what that is, because a lot of people have different ideas on God. And so
that's
they say if they define that God as this all loving thing,
mhm,
then you would imagine, then it would follow that whatever God creates would entail lovingness to such a maximal degree that we couldn't really refute that. But we look into reality and we don't see that. So we know that, under certain definitions of God. God hates suffering. God hates, quote unquote, sin. God hates all these things. Well, we
Mm,
see that in the world. That's what they talk about, are these things that exist in the world, and God is going to actually overthrow the suffering and overthrow the sin and death and all of these things. And so by definition, there's like a bit of incoherency in my view on that
mhm,
definition of God. But if you were to define God as, and well, also too, what do we mean by best possible world?
mhm.
Um, like I have a friend, his name is Tom Jump, T Jump. He has a channel,
Oh,
and
yeah, I've seen some of his stuff. Yeah.
yeah, and he talks a lot about this, a church of his church of the best possible worlds. So he's talking
All right.
about, like you say, if there's a world that exists where you have one less stump toe, that would automatically be better than the one we live in. So God didn't create the best possible world. The fact that
Mm,
we can imagine a world that's better demonstrates that this actually does not exist. But then again, my view is that, well, we may not necessarily live in the best possible world, but that doesn't mean that the best possible world doesn't exist or can't exist. And so that would, again, still kind of be consistent with God. The fact that there is such a world that exists. Maybe you call it heaven, maybe you call it something else. I don't know. But this particular world, well, he would say, well, it's immoral to be in this world because it goes against your will. Like, his whole thing is that morality is defined as um the imposition of will. That's immorality. Anytime you impose on someone's will. I
mm.
didn't have a choice but to be born in this world of suffering, sin, and death. So how was that not immoral
Can I
on God's part to put
question
me
that?
here? You know what I mean?
Can I?
So
Sorry to interrupt. Can I just ask a
uh
question there?
yeah.
You say, what was it? I didn't make the choice to come here.
Right. So that's what he would say. He would
Oh,
say,
okay. I see.
I don't know that I made a choice to be here.
Yeah.
So as far as he's concerned, he believes that he didn't make a choice. All he knows is that he was born into a world of suffering, right? And
Hmm.
so that would be an immoral God. That would be a God that created a soul into a reality that it's going to suffer to some degree. Could have done otherwise, could have put him in heaven
Mm,
to begin with. And so
hmm.
this kind of refutes that God definition of the all loving God.
Mm.
Now, it could be an evil God, or it could be an amoral God, one that just doesn't give a damn. Or, there's a third option, I would say, that we did choose to be here,
Mm.
that we actually, this is just an incarnation of a localized conscious experience. That could be true. We have a lot of testimony to that through NDEs, but I don't know if that's true or not. So I'm just kind of
So
agnostic.
let me get in here for a second. I've been listening to this whole thing. I don't want you to think that I was just
Hmm.
screwing off somewhere, but I thought you guys might contribute more than I, because I'm just honestly, I think some of this is not really worth spending too much of my time getting caught up into, because
Mm,
I'm not sure. Maybe I could reach a solid conclusion one way or the other, but I'm not sure if I can. So I think I'd rather focus my time and energy in areas where I know I could for sure make something concrete. But anyway, that being said, I don't believe in Mormon theology, but I think Mormon theology does a phenomenal job of answering some questions that straightforward, straight line Christianity doesn't answer.
mm,
And if you go by their theology, everybody was created already perfectly, like in heaven. And so yeah, so everyone is already born there by God having a lot of sex, by the way. Their theology is
mhm.
whacked out, man, because apparently God basically is having sex all day long, because everyone who gets born is created from God having sex with his wife. But I digress. That's another issue altogether. But anyway, the point is that for them, this time on Earth is a period of ascension where we're trying to get to the next stage, which, in their opinion, you can become your own god, and you could basically make a creation. But it totally makes sense as far as the problem of evil, that you would consent to knowing that you're leaving something that's much better to come
Mm-hmm.
down to the mud, so that you could like crawl through the mud to get to the other side. So I
Mm-hmm.
do think that there might be some additional, if you just take straightforward Christianity doctrine, I think you're going to run into some serious problems. But if you throw in a few little caveats, you're like, oh, okay, this actually can make sense. That, for instance, you guys are mentioning a stub toe, but most people mention cancer, especially cancer for children. But if you think about this for a second, if you're in heaven and you don't have any kind of cures to try to help out your fellow mankind, there's no motivation like to try to benefit, uh, humanity and society. Um, Also, too, like if everyone's rich, then and everyone already has more than enough, there would be no opportunity to be generous and to develop a side of self-sacrifice and
Mm-hmm.
giving of yourself. So I think
Mm-hmm.
there's some thoughts there that if you just, like, at first glance, it definitely, problem of evil seems like it just destroys um, Christianity specifically, but a lot of other religions as well. But I think if you think about it a little bit more, there are some things that do kind of make sense about it. But yeah, I just wanted to throw my ideas on that a little bit. But you guys get back at it.
Oh yeah, it's you can imagine a way where it can work. Like you asked the question, is it internally coherent? So we can make it coherent by saying that we existed before in heaven in a perfect world, the best possible world. And from the best possible world, we chose to go to the least best possible world, or somewhere in between. And that way it works because no one's being violated. It's mutual and everything like that. The question is it plausible? We don't know if it's plausible. Well, do we have real examples in the real world? Well, we have NDE people who claim that that's their testimony. Um, I don't tend to think that people who talk about their NDEs are lying, but I don't really know what the real attribution is. I couldn't really say for 100%. I do believe that there is some sort of experience that they must go into. That is sort of consistent with theism, even on naturalistic theism. But that experience, um, it's bad and good. And so yeah, you could still fear death under theism. Yeah, you could fear death under theism. You could fear death under idealism, even naturalistic, even supernatural idealism. You don't know, because of the fact that you don't know what to expect. I think everybody has that problem. Um, it's like I could say, oh, they're about to ship me off to this far off island I don't know anything about. Yeah, I would be fearful because I know how the natural world is. I know that I'm susceptible to get bitten by a snake or some other thing, weather, whatever is going to hurt me. The same thing after I die. How do I know that if it's true, like what Bernardo Kastrup says, that we're kind of like a ripple in the lake, and or a whirlpool in the ocean. When my whirlpool dissolves, aka death, then I go into this sea of consciousness, whatever that means. Well, what happens after that? Do I form another whirlpool somewhere else? Um, what does that entail? I don't know. And so there's a lot to be afraid of. A lot of people think that, oh, you're just an idealist because you're afraid of death. Like, no, actually, I would probably be more comfortable knowing that when I die, I'm just gone.
Yeah, there's
That's
comfort
just
in
my
that.
personal, yeah,
If anything, the wishful thinking is the other way around. I mean, look at
exactly.
how the Buddhists view the thing. It's all about escape from rebirth. They
Yes.
talk about escaping samsara, and that's something that you attain, and that you're here to pursue the noble truths to attain this escape, you know. And then you got all of these skeptical types that are like, no, well, I think oblivion is guaranteed and I don't have to work towards it, and it's just what I'm going. And you're the one with your comfortable wishful thinking. It's like, well, okay, try and tell that to the Buddhists who think that you
Right.
really have to work for this thing that you think is a guarantee.
Right.
And is it even coherent anyway? Is the idea of oblivion even coherent?
No.
Yeah, is it like the idea that nothing can be?
Right.
How are you going to say that non-existence is?
Right. What does that mean? It lacks everything. So it's one of those things where it's wishful thinking to wish that, I just go to sleep, like go into
Yeah.
this deep, dark sleep where I don't see anything, whatever. That would be peaceful and great. But the fact is, I have a sneaking suspicion that's not going to be that easy for me. It's going to be, oh shit, here we go again. And we're going to go
Yeah.
into some other sort of, I'm going to go into some other sort of incarnation, and it's going to suck just like this one did. And there's no reason for me to think otherwise. So come on now. I mean,
Yeah.
that's the whole thing. I don't know what it is that people think. People have this idea of death. I think what it is that religion has taught people so much about heaven and the blissfulness of heaven, and the 73 virgins or whatever, that 72 virgins, whatever the case is, getting your own planet in the afterlife. All these great things come to you in the afterlife. They don't know any of these things, and they forget about the story about hell, and they forget about the suffering part, and they just assume that my grandma, she's up there in heaven when she died. How do you know she ain't down there still baking cookies without an oven?
Yeah.
So
The only hell I believe in is hell on earth. That and
yeah,
fear of hell. I think these are real, Fear
yeah,
of hell that's been perpetuated by religious organizations and individuals, and hell on earth, which is the unnecessary suffering which makes us contemplate the problem of evil in the first place. One
yeah.
of the things I think that the yogis really get right is that for the most part, we're asking the wrong questions. So we
Hmm.
ask all these questions about, is there a God? Is there a heaven? Is the nature of reality mental or physical? And despite the existence of this phrase navel gazing, I think that the most pertinent question is the nature of the self,
Hmm.
which is something that the yogis and various other Eastern traditions look into um, with a lot more further than most of us in the West do.
Hmm.
We tend to take it like the big question is there an almighty creator, and we just debate that with all of our argumentation and everything else. And so when we expose ourselves to these other traditions, say, well, maybe you're starting in the wrong place. Let's just stop asking whether God exists and ask if you exist, and
Right.
look into the nature of the self. And for me, I mean, I already, when I discovered Bernardo Kastrup's existence and his arguments a couple of years or so ago, I was already down the idealism line. But for me, it's because my gateway drug was self-inquiry,
Hmm.
the meditative practice coming from the East, that actually it's introspection. It's looking into the nature of the self that answers the bigger questions. Um, it's kind of like, how like you can be looking for something, and you find something else that you needed, like you say you were looking for your keys,
Hmm.
and like you check a certain drawer and you're like, there's that battery that I needed for that other
Mm.
thing. So
Yeah.
rather than conducting a search for God, they talk about conducting a search for the self. And yeah, okay, maybe it is navel gazing, maybe it's woo woo or mumbo jumbo or any kind of the other different ways that we can just hand wave it away.
Hmm.
um but I I very much think it's worth looking into. I think these meditative practices have been shown to elicit some of the same results as, for example, taking a psychoactive substance like mushrooms or cactus juice or something.
Uh,
Yep.
And imagine that, just a thought line, a single thought line. can lead you to a psychedelic spiritual experience.
Oh yeah,
How's that?
I've done
Um,
DMT. Yeah.
Hmm.
have either of you ever done a sensory deprivation tank,
No.
Mm-mm. I wanted to
Scott?
though.
So
I
yeah,
really wanted
I
to.
did one. Yeah, I did one in America, and then I did something that was very similar to a sense deprivation tank, which was just walking in the desert in Israel for like 4 straight hours. Because like you get into like for me, obviously I still had my senses, but going on and like not having anything, any kind of sounds or any kind of anything other than just emptiness, just sand, just over and over and over and over and over again. It did actually help me get into a meditative state. And so Paul, I live in Asia, so I am aware
Mhm.
of Buddhism. A lot of people here are Buddhist, and I do think that they have a bit of an edge as far as some of the philosophy is I think I think as a Christian I can learn from it. And but you also mentioned some of the yogis and about the exploration of self. I just have to say that just that quite frankly, thank God that more societies don't have that inside of their as far like a driving force, because those people isolate themselves out in the middle of nowhere, and they basically,
Mm.
as I don't know, again, we'll bring it up again, navel gazing, but they're doing a lot of self, introspection and all this stuff, and they're not really contributing anything to the society or world as a whole. So, I mean, when I see the
Mm.
Buddhists here, the monks here in South Korea, they're basically just walking around, and they have to live off other people's generosity, and they do their meditations and chants and all that stuff. But it's I think as a Christian, I there's certain things I can learn from them, but I think that they definitely are missing something. They are missing something by removing themselves that much from society, in
Yes,
my
yes,
opinion.
yes, yes. I was gonna say that there's something about being in this reality. Like, yeah, there's a lot to be said for introspection and meditation and everything like that. That's a good way to ground yourself. But it's a good way to ground yourself so that you can wake up now and go out in the world and interact, because
Mm.
we're
Right.
here to do that work, to interact, whether regardless of whether you're an atheist or not. You're here to live, and living entails interacting with other people, and we're communal animals. So, when we do good for others, we learn something, we help others, we help make ourselves feel better, we increase our conscious experience somehow. And so that's kind of a a way, of part of living out your philosophy or living out your beliefs. It's not good enough just to have beliefs, it's good to also live them out and actuate them, and that gives it more meaning. Like, we can all sit back and talk about, like Paul was saying, like, does God exist or doesn't he exist, and then use all our energy to argue with people online or wherever about the subject, and then yet we're not doing anything, we're not actually helping anyone, we're not really contributing anything meaningful, I don't think.
Amen.
Yeah, that's good. Paul. Speaking of
Hey.
being in Asia, or
Mhm.
I was talking about being in Asia, so. It is
Mm.
1:20 right now, so I do have to get going. But if you have any last thoughts, I'd really love to hear it. And just want to really thank you for your contributions to the channel. I'm about to do a little bit of research of some of the stuff you're talking about, because some of that stuff was flying over my head, quite frankly. It could be that it's just too advanced for me, or it could be that it's 1 o'clock in the morning, but not everything was registering in my mind. It could also be the British accent. So take whatever one of those makes me look the least bad, I'm willing to sign up for that option.
I'm totally happy to take all the blame you need me to take because of my accent. It's perfectly fine. Not a problem at all.
Anyway, last
No,
thoughts.
I guess the best way to wrap up what we've just been going over is to say that just something like all good things in moderation. You know, you can say meditation and prayer is good for you for various different reasons. Prayers of thanks might help to instill a sense of gratitude in you.
Mhm.
Meditation will help keep you grounded and fight things like anxiety and such. But if all you're doing is praying and meditating and maybe, I don't know, drinking water and jogging or something, then you're not really fulfilling any kind of purpose or meaning that you could be otherwise doing with your life.
Amen.
So yeah, just because something may be good in moderation doesn't mean that to do it in excess is advised. And I can completely understand where you're coming from in that in a culture where self-inquiry is much more widespread, that this can lead to societal problems just in the same way as like the culture where there's too much nihilism or too much what's the word I'm looking for?
Too much atheism.
Xenophobia. You know, any too much atheism.
I'm gonna kill
Well,
you,
atheism,
Isaiah. I'm
it's,
gonna kill
it's
How to
not so
you,
get
much
you,
bro.
Scott? How
necessarily
to
a
get you
problem
all
in
the
and of
time?
itself. It's just the nature abhors a vacuum. So atheism, in the case of like, I don't necessarily believe what somebody else is claiming about a god, then that's all well and good. But if you empty yourself of all sorts of connection with any kind of
Hmm.
connection with divinity, then what tends to happen is that things will come in to replace it, and people will develop secular pseudo religions, and we're already seeing it in several different ways. I think I don't really want to open any of those cans right now, but
Oh
maybe
It's
man,
that'll
called the
be the subject for another pod.
it's called progressive liberalism. I'm just
Progressive
kidding. No.
liberalism. I
I'm
don't
sorry.
mind it when it's progressive and when it's liberal. It's when
I
progressive
call
No,
it
it's
the
called
liberalism becomes Orwellian, it becomes a
Trumpism.
problem. Whereas
I
progressive
call it the
liberalism,
cult
as
of
long as it's
atheism.
liberal and as long as it's progressive, those two things, if it
Yeah,
sticks to those two qualities, then we're all good.
that's right.
But
I would just wrap up on my part and say that you're right. It's good to actually get out and do good things. Just try to make a difference. Try to be positive. Um, this whole discussion on the mind body problem. I mean, it's very interesting, and it
mm,
can also be a catalyst to do more introspection and do more good for the world. It may, everybody's a subject, so everybody's got a different way of taking in information and applying it. And for me, it kind of helps, but like I said, it kind of leaves me kind of sad in a way too, because it just opens up the idea that this, like I said, the fears of death, and maybe this isn't it, and maybe more crappy stuff is coming down the line. Who knows? But I don't care about that. I don't really believe it. I just focus in on my experience and what's going on and what makes sense to me at the time, and um, try to be the best I can be, man. Try to treat people with respect. Um, leave the world better than I left it. That's my philosophy. Um, but yeah, the cultivate atheism. It's a strong force, and we're coming at you, Isaiah.
Well, it I do joke about that, but it's like I was an atheist for a while myself, and my issue is not with the people who reject God, but the people who say, "Well, I reject God." And you're talking about the vacuum right now. I thought that was a really good analogy, but it's to also say that if you found God, then or you can't. I haven't found God, so you can't find God, and
Hmm.
basically you're delusional and you're immoral for believing in something that for me has utterly changed my life.
yeah.
And so I do, I do want to end off. I will tell you what I experienced in that desert after about 4 hours of hiking into nothing. I was thinking about South Korea. We greet each other with "안녕하세요," which literally translates to "Are you at peace?" But it just means like hello. And
Yeah,
then
like it.
in in Arabic they say salam alaikum, which means like peace be upon you. And
Mm.
then in the Jewish people they say shalom, which means like peace. And so these three places, no one particularly would say that these places are peaceful because, well, obviously we know what's going on right now, and in South Korea, actually, still technically at war. It's the most fortified boundary in the world between North and South Korea. So they're not fighting, but they're definitely not at peace.
Mm.
So I started to think about that, about why these people greet each other with peace. And I started to think about something as well, though, that I was trying to be an advocate for peace in the world, and yet I wasn't at peace within. And I found it to be so contradictory that I hadn't come to terms with my upbringing, with my past, with my trauma that I experienced. And I was essentially running for myself. And that opened up a floodgate to me eventually finding my way back to religion. But I do want to end off on this because, and sorry to get back to movies again, but have either of you gentlemen seen About Time?
No, not me.
Nope.
Sir, well, I think it's based in the UK because I definitely know like the guys have British accents and uh yeah, yeah,
There are
it's
many.
based in the UK. But anyway, they this father and this son, they're able to travel back in time, and at the very end of the movie, the son says that his father tells him the way to be happy, which is that you live every day twice. Okay, every day he goes back and he lives every day that he's lived twice. And what he does the first day is that he does everything, all of his obligations that he has to do. And then the second day he goes and he lives it again. He takes the time to really like savor every last thing that's happening all around him. So it's like he has both the monotony and he has both of the slowing down and kind of being present in every last moment.
Mm.
And then the son says that was like, he recognized what his dad was doing, but he said, I actually found it myself, which was, I never go back in time anymore. He goes, the only thing I do is I think every single day is the one day that I've traveled back to time into, and that's the last day that I get to exist. And I thought that was so profound because either of those scenarios, even without the gift of time travel, like we can experience those every day. We can take in the mundane and then just the special things that happen that we don't probably even notice on a daily basis. Like we're getting ready to enter into the spring, but just to notice things like bees that are flying around and flowers that are starting to bloom, and just the little small things that are miracles that are around us every day. And I think we can get a little bit bogged down with these kind of issues, and especially if we're starting to argue and get contentious about it, that let's not forget that there's some beautiful, amazing things around us, and that there's people. I think most importantly is that I think Scott was talking about how we're detached from each other. We don't really know if my red is your red, or we don't really know, you know what I mean? We don't really know exactly what it is that you're experiencing. But ultimately, at the end of the day, I don't need to know exactly what you're experiencing to know that you're a human being and you have, hang-ups in your life and you're striving to be a better person. But I'm not certainly the best person I know I could be. So I would just say let's encourage each other and try to help out each other as much as we can. So that's all I want to end off with. Don't get too caught up in the jargon
Amen.
that you two are using. No, I'm just kidding. But no, thank you guys for. Paul, do you have a channel that you do, or you just kind of mess around sometimes online? Like, do you have any?
Not really. I did start one time, but I haven't really kept up with it. So maybe in the future I will.
Hold on.
My second name is
I do.
Misell, Misell. Yeah, I can be found on Facebook. I'm present there in a lot of debate groups. Talk about these metaphysical things.
I
Good
gotta
science,
have you
dude.
back on again. Really enjoyed having you on. I do want
Oh,
to end off
sweet,
on a
yeah,
high
okay.
note. So take a gander at this real quick, because
Uh-huh.
and I got a funny story to tell you about this one.
Mm.
But look at this.
You learn martial arts together?
What's that?
Oh, watch this. Wait for it. Wait for it. Come on. I'm trying to show you something right now.
Uh-huh.
Because when I went to Buckingham Palace,
You learn
I
martial
walked
arts
directly
together?
up to the
You learn martial arts together?
one of the.
And
I had that sword.
well,
Wow.
Nice.
He broke him.
Yeah, I broke one of the guards there, and it was like the first joke. I walked up and just got her. She just caved immediately. And then I switched my attention to the other one, and I tried for like 10 minutes. I could not. She was stone faced, man. So I just gave up and I left. But yeah, I wanted to end off with something on a high note. But yeah, thanks again, and I'm definitely gonna have to have you back again, because you're a little bit smarter than me, which isn't saying much, but I definitely think you can make some great contributions to the channel. So with that being said, I want to leave you with this outro. And yeah, we look forward to seeing you back again. Don't forget to subscribe. For now.